Methodology Research Opportunities webinar. I am Mio Kim, Professor of Biostatistics at the University of California, San Francisco School of Medicine. I'm the moderator of today's webinar. We have acclaimed panelists with ample experience with PCORI as reviewers, consultants, awardees, and advisors. They will share their first-hand experience, offering invaluable insights and practical resources. This webinar is sponsored by ASA, Committee on Funded Research. We will start with a quick overview of PCORI's method funding opportunities and the application process. Then panelists' presentation will follow. We will hold the Q&As until the end of the panelists' presentation. Okay, so what is PCORI? PCORI is a nonprofit, non-governmental institution authorized by Congress in 2010. And in 2019, it was reauthorized for 10 years. It is the largest public research funder focusing on comparative effective research and related method and infrastructure. It typically offers the 3 cycles of the funding per year. And improving method is one of it's a standing funding program. And each projects are funded up to 3 years and then up to 750,000 total direct cost. Its review criteria are these 6 of them. And some of them are very similar as the overlaps with the NIH's review criteria, such as scientific merits, investigators, and environments. But the rest of them are PCORI specific and then very heavily focusing on the patient-centered comparative effectiveness research. And a very high-level overview of the application and then funding process looks like this. Typically about a month before the letter of intent is due, funding program announcement is issued. And then within a month from the letter of intent is due, decisions on the letter of intents are made, and then people will hear that they will be invited or not. And full applications are due about 3 months from the LOI due dates. And funded projects will start about 13 months from the LOI due dates. The one single most important documents in this application and the funding process is the PCORI's funding announcement. It contains the general information on the PCORI's policy and then the letter of intent process and then the merit review process. But it also contains the cycle-specific information. So one thing very important is that the PCORI listed out that it's a high research priority areas. So, and then those research priority areas are continuously updated as the PCORI's funding profile changes. So for example, one update to the 2023 second cycle of the funding announcement is that PCORI will no longer consider applications in the area of the design and conduct of cluster randomized trials. So it's very important to review these single documents. Now we can proceed to the panelist presentation. Our first presenter is Dr. Kelly Kidwell. She's a professor and then associate chair of academic affairs at the University of Michigan. Her research focuses on sequential multiple assignment randomized trial or smart design and analysis to study treatment in rare diseases and to incorporate patient preference in treatment assignment. She has been the principal investigator of the 2 PCORI contracts, a review panelist for PCORI proposals, is a member of PCORI's clinical trial advice panel, and also is a consultant as well. Okay, Kelly, take it away.
Thank you so much. So I'll just give a few tidbits of information regarding the PCORI process for myself to hopefully help. So I've had 2 contracts, as Mio just said. There have been both in improving methods. They're 3-year contracts. The first one was improving trial design and analysis for treatments for rare diseases. And the second was design methodological development for patient preference smart designs. My first PCORI contract was funded on the first submission, and the second one I was not funded on the first submission. I was invited to resubmit and funded on that resubmission. Something that PCORI does is that every project that is funded then gets a summary page online for anyone to see. So you can like Google my name, PCORI, and you'll find these 2 pages. You also have to write a final report for your contracts. And so those are also publicly available. So for my first, that's there, and my second has not completed yet. So here are a few tips for the letter of intent stage. I definitely suggest that you really need to address the priority areas. So just as was said, they write in their improving methods PFA, the specific areas in which they're looking for proposals. And it seems to me that PCORI is really looking for a programmatic fit and to balance their funding portfolio. So they're really specifically interested in these areas and want you to address them. And I think the LOIs that are not invited to submit the full proposal do not address those programmatic areas. They also have some priority populations for which you do not have to address, but I think does help if you can. Just like NIH or any other grant, it's really useful to talk to a program officer to gauge interest in your idea. And then something to note is from the letter of intent stage to the main application, you can't change your primary goals of the proposal or your main aims. So you really want to make sure that you flesh these out in the letter of intent and that you're comfortable with them moving forward in the full application. Then from the letter of intent, when you're invited to submit the full application, there's only usually a few months. However, if you can, it's great to start earlier. And what I've noticed is that the PCORI internal system can be relatively difficult to navigate. And even though Michigan has dealt with PCORI, there often seem to be these bugs and issues at the last minute. So being able to complete your part of the project at least 3 days, if not a week ahead of time, to give time for these potential bugs is really important and something that you might not be used to with like NIH proposals. PCORI gives templates on their website for all the pieces of the full application, and I do suggest using those. The only template I did not use was the BioSketch. I do use my NIH BioSketch, but otherwise I used all of their templates. And something that helped me the most, particularly in my first submission, was I reached out to someone who I knew had received PCORI funding. So actually Mengang Yu, I reached out to him and he was so kind as to share his proposal. And that really helped me think about how a PCORI proposal looked and what was included. And so several individuals have reached out to me and I'm more than happy to provide my documents to see if that could help on the in terms of thinking about how you present your ideas. The last thing that I want to mention here is that if you're writing in funding students in your PCORI proposal, something to note is that PCORI will fund stipend and benefits, but they will not fund tuition. So you'll have to think about how you're going to supplement your tuition. You don't have to include that in your proposal, but just for you, yourself, and your budgeting, you have to think about how you'd fund those students. I just have examples here about how I was specifically responsive to the calls or to the PFAs in terms of the methods to improve study design. My first proposal really was thinking about methods to improve validity and efficiency of analyses in terms of interpretability, value, and use, and focused on a priority population of rare diseases. Whereas my second design focused on the methods to manage adaptation of treatment strategies while maintaining threats to internal validity and really improve the design and conduct of patient-centered outcomes research initiative. Something that PCORI is looking for that really differs from other grant proposals is this patient and stakeholder engagement. And that can be really difficult to think about as a statistician. So something that I've done in my contracts is to form what we call an advisory board that meets biannually. And it's made up of clinicians, statisticians, and patient advocates. They at first pre-pandemic, we had some in-person meetings, but subsequently it's been all virtual. We really just review our project. We ask for feedback. We ask to, are really asking to ensure that things make sense and are applicable. And one thing that's been especially helpful here is in ways that we can disseminate our work beyond statistical journals or statistical conferences. And so I've gotten some really great connections via actually the patient advocates on our team for connecting and giving talks and going to places. Our individuals in our advisory board, we decided on all except for one patient advocate prior to submitting the proposal. And all of those were included in the bio sketches and letters of support. So I think I've taken more than my fair share, but I'll just say that PCORI is a great opportunity in terms of having money for methods funding. And they're somewhat disease agnostic, so individuals interested in clinical trial design and analysis, this is a great place to propose your ideas and receive that funding. There is some, maybe I shouldn't say this, but micromanagement of the contract. It's a contract, not a grant. However, in all my interactions with those at PCORI, they really want you to succeed and work with you to make those modifications to ensure that things will eventually go smoothly. And then one thing that has sort of been maybe somewhat surprising to me is that, that engagement with stakeholders isn't just a checkbox. It really has improved my research and broadened the impact, I think, of what we're doing. And so that's been something that's been very useful and different than had I gotten funding elsewhere. This two-part process, though, can be somewhat challenging and take some time to get the funding. It is a contract, not a grant, so there's this higher level of oversight and sort of more documentation needed for your progress. Like I said, they don't fund student tuition, and you have to create this final report, which can sometimes feel like an extra project that you don't want to do at the end, but they've been trying to make this somewhat better. And then figuring out that engagement piece can be difficult, but hopefully hearing our options here will be helpful in that. So thank you.
Thanks, Kelly. All right. So our second panelist is Dr. Fan Lee. He's an associate professor of biostatistics at Yale University School of Public Health. Dr. Lee obtained his biostatistics doctoral degree from Duke University in 2019 and has joined Yale since July 2019. His research focuses on causal inference methods for observational studies and the pragmatic clinical trials, especially those that employ cluster randomization. Dr. Lee has also contributed to new method development for studying causal mediation, treatment effect heterogeneity, and selection bias. He has been the principal investigator of the 3 PCORI contracts, an internal statistician for PCORI final research report team, and also is a consultant for PCORI as well. Okay, Ben, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Mio. And it's a great pleasure to be here and to share my experiences for PCORI as well. Just to reiterate, then all of my 3 PCORI awards I have obtained are under the call for improving methods for conducting patient-centered comparative clinical effectiveness research. My first award was more focusing on developing study design methods to enable the detection of not only the average effect, but also treatment effect moderation in cluster randomized trials. And my second award focuses on improving the causal inference rigor for staggered rollout cluster randomized trials, also known as stepped wedge designs, by formulating causal estimates and try to improve efficiency over model-based methods. And then my last award studies causal mediation methods for cluster randomized designs that are increasingly of interest in implementation science research. I've also served as a co-I and sub-award PIs on several other PCORI methods award, focusing on observational studies and causal methods. And as you can see, the 3 awards that I'm PI of heavily focused on the context of cluster randomized trials. And that was a time when PCORI is highly interested in getting portfolios on cluster randomized trials and stepped wedge cluster randomized trials. And I'm just going to take one example to explain my experiences, both on the perspectives of developing a PCORI proposal, but also from the perspective of navigating an award. So my first, so the example would be the award titled New Methods for Planning Cluster Randomized Trials to Detect Treatment Effect Heterogeneity. This directly responds to the priorities set by PCORI back in 2021 in their cycle 3. Their document specifically says that they're interested in methods to improve the design and conduct of cluster randomized trials, including methods to account for dependence of observations within clusters. And in this particular award, we are developing a set of appropriate correlation structures to account for dependence of the final outcome observations, as well as effect modifiers to enable the appropriate design and power calculations of these trials to enable different objectives. And I also felt that it is important during the development of this proposal that it helps to write the proposal with patient-centered research in mind, which is actually emphasized in several documents of the PCORI website. And then in particular, under the development of this award, it addressed the treatment effect heterogeneity, which is an important goal in increasingly many pragmatic clinical trials that are employed to study patient-centered research questions. And we also have exemplified in the proposal several patient-centered outcomes, as well as effect modifiers that would be of intrinsic interest to patients and stakeholders. In addition, the topic of heterogeneity of treatment effect is actually a key component of the PCORI methodology standards that have been listed on their website, and you're also required to check the list when you submit your proposal to PCORI. And so we're actually responding to gaps under those guidance documents. And then in addition, we've also included and exemplified several motivating cluster randomized trials where the principal investigators of those trials have long been interested in assessing treatment effect moderation, but they also realized that methods for planning trials to enable those objectives were met are actually very scarce. And then in terms of navigating a funded award, I'm going to take this award as an example to continue. And I would want to highlight maybe differences between the traditional NIH award. In terms of, first of all, there is a milestone process for you to complete. Either it's monthly or bi-monthly. So that is a little bit relevant to how PCORI manages an awardee in terms of they want to make sure that you are progressing toward your goals in a smooth fashion. So there will be a set of checklists that you pre-specify in your award submission process, and you are going to complete and check those boxes along the way as you complete your award. And these can range from developing specific protocols for achieving your aim, as well as updating your plans for engaging stakeholders, as well as deliverable updates, updating publications, as well as talks and seminars you give that is based on the output from this award. The other aspect that I think is strikingly different from other awarding, other funding system is that there is an emphasis on stakeholder engagement. And under the example award I have, we have thought about who would be the stakeholders of this award, since this is an award that focuses on methods development. And so we have included principal investigators who are the leaders of the pragmatic trials that we use as examples to motivate the study, as well as applied statisticians who will likely be the end users of the software that we develop to facilitate these designs. And we have actually collaborated along the way, the statistician stakeholders on the development of this of these methods, as we have conversations with them on what's really important and how to maximize the impact of this award. And then should I stop because Donna raised her hand? Okay, never mind.
I cede my time to you, Fan.
Okay, I apologize. I'll be fast.
Yeah, no, take your time.
There's no stakeholder, so there's no patient stakeholders for this project, but I know that PCORI may enforce that in some other occasions, and I have that experience as well. In terms of how stakeholder engagement can happen, there are a few examples that I want to list here, including regular stakeholder meetings with a concrete agenda item. And for example, under this example award, we have actually invited stakeholders to discuss and contribute their thoughts to the question of whether detecting treatment effect modification is more important than studying the subgroup effects in a particular cluster randomized trials. And then even though we don't reach a consensus, but we have arguments supporting each of these objectives, which made us realize these are important goals to pursue simultaneously. There's another occasion where we conducted an actual formal Delphi survey, polling stakeholder opinions on their preferences on methods in terms of the usability as well as the interpretability. There is no ground formula for engaging stakeholders, and you are actually encouraged to be innovative depending on the needs of your project. As a final thought, I just want to highlight that PCORI has a focused agenda on comparative effectiveness research. And so it would be ideal to check the PFA before you put in an application and decide on topic you want to study. PCORI also works through a contract. It's not a traditional grant, and therefore it'll be ideal to understand what expenses are allowed versus not allowed. For example, if you are funding a student, they don't allow for tuition, but they could pay for stipend. It is strongly advised to be realistic about the planned work for PCORI application, because there's a milestone document. And so if you have a significant delay, you have you need to discuss with the PCORI team and possibly even consider contract modification if you deviate from the planned research. It is always a good idea to start early in the writing process. You have about 8 weeks in developing the full proposal if your LOI is invited. And that is not only limited to developing the research plan, but also includes other documents such as milestones, methodology checklist, as well as several other documents that might require time to fully flesh out. And you're also required and strongly encouraged to include letters of support, not only from the co-Is, but also from the stakeholders. That's my experience. And then finally, when I started writing my first PCORI award, I have 2 co-Is who had a previous PCORI award on different topics, and they have shared very valuable experiences in guiding me on how to write in terms of having patient-centered research in mind. It's not only about your mathematical formula, but also about the impact of this development regarding the patient-centered research in general, as well as PCORI's genuine interest on their agenda to fund comparative effectiveness research. And so I think that's important. It'll be helpful to seek input from experienced awardees at various stages of your award development, and you might benefit from that. So that's my last slide, and thank you so much for listening.
Thanks, Ben. Our third and last panelist is Dr. Daniel Schwartzstein. He's a professor and chief of biostatistics in the Department of Population Health Science at the University of Utah School of Medicine. He joined the University of Utah in 2020 after spending 23 years on the faculty in the Department of Biostatistics at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. His research focuses on how to draw inferences about treatment effects in presence of the selection bias. Specifically, he works on how to report results in prospective studies when informative missingness or censoring occurs, irregular assessment time exists, and/or treatment assignment is non-random and time-varying. His research has been funded by NIH, FDA, and PCORI. Dan, please.
All right, thank you. I only have a little bit to add to what Kelly and Fawn shared. So I'll just share my screen here. Try that. So I've had 3 awards. I had one quite early, which was called Sensitivity Analysis Tools for Clinical Trials of Missing Data. And the way that I addressed the PFA was there was a call for the development of software to reduce barriers that inhibit the use of more rigorous methods for handling missing data. I then have, and that one is completed, and then I have 2 active ones. One is called Sensitivity Analysis Methods for Pragmatic Trials with Irregular and Informative Census Times. And I addressed the PFA by improving the analysis of pragmatic trials that are designed to address PCOR or comparative effectiveness research questions. And that was the second priority for that specific PFA. And then we just got funded by another one, which is called Machine Learning Approaches to Personalized Lung Cancer Therapy with Real-World Data. And this is joint with my colleague at the University of Utah, Jing-Chen Shen. And the area that we addressed was to improve the use of machine learning in clinical research. And that was the first priority of the PFA. And like Kelly and Fawn, these awards were all through the Improving Methods call for proposals. So on my studies, I also had advisory board composed of stakeholders. So my most recent, the middle one, the irregular and informative assessment times, we have people on our advisory board who are implementation scientists and clinical researchers and clinical trialists and statisticians and mixed method researchers and patients. And similarly, I had an advisory board on my first one, which was more probably statistically focused. And then on the last one, we have an advisory board, which includes a lot of, it includes patient advocates for people with cancer, and it includes people with expertise with patient-reported outcomes, and it includes clinicians who treat patients with lung cancer. So in terms of just some comments, I think it's super important to be responsive to the PFA, to reach out to the program officer. It's a contract, not a grant. Realize that there's a lot of attachments that are required to submit a PCORI grant. Follow the instructions carefully. There are lots of instructions, and just pay attention to them. Take the engagement section very, very seriously. It's something that PCORI takes very seriously. Typo there, but there are certain review criteria that are listed when PCORI reviews your grant. And really, I would say, look at each criteria and address them and highlight them in your proposal. Do not leave the proposal preparation to the last minute. There's just a lot to do. And unlike Kelly and Fawn, I don't know if I was as lucky, at least on my last two proposals, to get them accepted on the first or the second round. So, but I would encourage you to be persistent and read the reviews you get back and modify your proposal. Don't give up. Be persistent. And then I would lastly just say, write your proposal to appeal to a diverse group of reviewers. It's going to be reviewed by not just statisticians. It's going to be reviewed by people who are, really interested in patient-centered outcome research. And so they're not all statisticians. And so to the extent that you can minimize jargon, and you can put math in there, but I would encourage you to explain what your formula are trying to communicate. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Okay, thanks, Dan. So it was a great presentation, and so there was one question mistakenly posted in the chat box, but I'm gonna read out to you. So one person asked that how's the PCORI's application differs from the NIH's application structure? Well, I think that this question sort of warrants that the individual's perspective. So how about Kelly? Would you like to start with?
Sure. So I think there's a question also about the length. It's a similar length in terms of the research strategy, but one page of that, or no more than one page, has to be dedicated to patient and stakeholder engagement. So in that sense, maybe you could think of it as 11 pages of the research strategy. And then there's additional pieces like dissemination, human subjects, people, et cetera, that come after that. And then obviously additional letters of support and et cetera. So somewhat similar length, but then some extra pieces. And that's why you want to pay attention to the templates. The template also specifies the sort of the the titles of the sections that you should have. So that can be a bit different than an NIH grant. But you can sort of think of it, there's definitely some similarity, but I think the point that Dan made is really important, that the review panel is quite different than likely you would get at NIH. For example, if you were to submit to the ASPA or, the formerly BMRD panel, the review panel at PCORI, you're going to have more people review it, and it's going to be less statistical. And so you definitely want to make sure that you're writing this. You have statistics in there, but you're really incorporating why it's important, how it's patient-centered. But again, I would recommend that you look at, if the new cycle is not posted, a past cycle for the template, and you can get more details there about exactly how it looks and how that differs from an NIH grant.
Okay, then?
Yeah, I agree with Callie's answer. I think it's actually mostly similar, but you have some extra information that's needed. And on top of what Callie said, I remember there's also a team and environment section that's as long as maybe one or two pages. You have to explain why your study team is ideally positioned to sort of carry out the research. And that's some, like, things like that would be part of the template. Actually, I think the template is informative. Under the headings of each section, they will give you some explanations on what they want to see. And so it's always good to download that and look into the latest one very carefully. Yeah.
Then?
Hey, I don't have anything to add. I think those are great
Okay.
responses. Thank you.
Okay. So we have quite a number posted in Q&A. So Haley asked 2 questions. One, so what goes into the ROI? That's one question. And then second question is, well, and give an idea, offering an advice on the theme for your methodology aims. Yes. So example that well, so let me combine that question. So first question is that what goes into the ROI? And second question is that well, is there any research area that it's more perceived as that responsive to the PCORI? Do you feel that way or not? And then also in terms of the methodology development and the software development, does the PCORI has that any preference? Actually, PCORI has the separate funding announcement for the dissemination related activities like developing the software. So, anyone to first answer question about the ROI?
Maybe I could go first. We can just rotate. And I think the LOI is, I mean, it's like a 2-page document, and then reference excluded, but it typically would include background and why you are doing this research and how important it is to patient-centered clinical research. And then also an outline of what you might do, but obviously no formulas. It's a very short document that is intended to engage interest from PCORI. And so you want to make sure you address the priorities listed in the PFA. Those things I think would go into it. And in terms of the themes of the methodology aims, typically my experiences of my own award and others, the first 2 or 3 aims would be on developing methods that centered around the unifying theme that we are addressing. The last one would be try to disseminate developing software and tool. And I know PCORI is really interested in also maximizing impact. And so having the aim on software deliverable eventually would be ideal, or tutorials on how that can be used for at least the motivating studies you're including, but also hopefully more broadly to other similar studies. Yeah.
So I have a recollection, now I'm maybe wrong about this, but there is a specific instruction in the PCORI literature about they don't want certain dissemination things. Like an aim cannot be, if I'm misremembering. I mean, I have software development in my aims, but they don't specifically want an aim about dissemination. if I
I think
remember
then
correctly.
your recollection is correct. So for example, developing that the sort of patient like a interactive web like a web interface development of such that those are not typically considered to be the proper theme for the methodology grant. Yes.
Right. But I guess they would allow for inclusion of an aim that develops, let's say, open source
Yeah,
statistical
totally,
software,
totally.
to implement the methods. That was what I was referring to. Yeah.
Yeah, but I just think you have to read the instructions very carefully because there are certain things that they specifically don't want as an aim.
Right.
So,
Right. And I think to that, maybe it's also worth mentioning that PCORI's website do have very detailed instructions on how, like what they want versus what they don't want, and how to even use the online submission portal and things like that. I found them really useful.
Yeah, I just want to add that in terms of the LOI, you can almost think of it as the specifics aim page. So like what you would have for an NIH grant, that's relatively what the LOI looks like, but it has a little bit more in terms of you have to have a little bit on the approach and a little bit about engagement. And so it's 2 pages long as opposed to the 1 specific aims page. But that's sort of how I think about the LOI.
Okay, thank you. So, and there's a one question about any sample proposals that the people can reference. I don't think there's any public repository of the proposals. So I think one has to reach out to whoever has a funded proposal to share. And then next one is that well, okay. Let me skip that and then so there's a question, if we propose to identify important genes, is biological validation plan required? So I think this is sort of the related to my earlier question of whether you think that there's any research area that fits better with the PCORI than other areas. So for example, biomarker discoveries or validation of some genetic biomarkers. Those
I mean, is that comparative effectiveness research?
I think that answers
I mean, if you
that.
can pitch it as comparative effectiveness research and make that argument, and it's patient-centered, then go for it, I would think. But they're going to be listing out specific things they're looking for in the PFA. And I think that's what you go for, right? And if you can make an argument that what you're proposing meets those specific requests, then great. And I would, before you actually go to the LOI stage, I would contact the program officer and say, hey, I want to do X, Y, and Z. What do you think? And they'll either say, yeah, I think that's a great idea, or go for it, or they'll say, no, I don't think that's responsive.
Okay, and another related question posted is that whether PCORI is just primarily entertaining the method-based proposal, or are there any opportunities for funding in the area of the secondary data analysis or statistics, data science, education? So this webinar is focusing on one of the PCORI's research program focusing on the improving method development. But PCORI's other programs, there's opportunity for the secondary data analysis and maybe actually relating to the data science and statistics education, as long as you can actually again frame around the centered theme of the patient-centeredness and the comparative effectiveness research. Anything else you wanted to add? Okay, and then so there's one question about what's the PCORI's history of a funding project history of funding projects submitted from the private sectors. Are you aware of any examples?
I don't know specifically, but what I can say is that PCORI has a long list of every project they've ever funded on their website, so you can go see what it is and who submitted that. In addition, they have these board of governor meetings that are public, and then they post like annual reports every year, and you can see the amount of funding and again who it goes to. So I would just suggest perusing the PCORI website, and likely you can find one of these annual reports that may have this information in it.
Thank you. And there's some questions about that the administrative side of the PCORI contract, which I don't think that the we can offer advice like indirect percentage. So I'm skipping those ones.
I mean, I think we can say there are indirect costs that they cover. I do think that they are lower than the NIH rate, I believe, but they do cover indirects. And then, yes, PI salary is allowed. PI effort is allowed on the grant. And in terms of effort, I believe that is up to you and your budgeting.
Exactly. Yeah.
Let me make one comment here, just on the administrative side. So it's a contract. So they're going to sign a contract with you and your university. They are not open to negotiation on certain aspects of the contract. So for example, that in the contract is a liability clause, some kind of liability clause, right? And they're not, your lawyers at your institution might say, I don't want to sign that. And PCORI is going to say, sorry, you either sign it or you don't get the contract. So there's that kind of aspect that you have to, think about at some stage.
That's right. And then there's a question about the success rate in the past. So unlike NIH, PCORI does not offer that the pay lines or percentiles. So it's kind of hard to say, but any of the panelists can offer that some idea of that how hard one needs to try. What's the competition?
So I don't have a percentage for you, but they do, again, in these like yearly reports or the Board of Governor reports, they do put out statistics of the number of LOIs received, the number fund and the number asked, invited to resubmit, the number of full applications submitted, and the number funded. So you can find all of those numbers, but they do change from year to year, and they do seem to be right. There's not a score that means you're getting funded. There's definitely more in terms of the programmatic fit that goes in there, but you can find all those numbers in their yearly reviews.
I will say it is becoming increasingly competitive. I remember when I first did it, there was very few applications and it was probably less competitive, but it's becoming more well known among the statistical community. So I think it's becoming more competitive, and I know that's why I put in my slides, be persistent, because I do think that if you just keep at it, you'll have I'm evidence of keeping at it and getting it funded. So I think it's worth it.
Yeah, very true. And I think another maybe point worth making is that I think I remember in the past few years, in every cycle, they're trying to award probably no more than 4 to 6 methods projects under this PFA. So that's sort of the number that they award in each cycle. But I don't have the denominator. I know they do turn down a lot of the LOI in that stage already. So people who don't respond to PFA directly, you'll find out that very early on. If you progress into the next stage, at least that means they're interested in what you're proposing.
Okay, so then can I kind of follow up on your, response to that, the being persistent? How did you find it that the PCORI's review comments? Do you find, like, if you can compare your, NIH reviews, yeah, or, just
some of them are hard for a statistician, because they're coming from, patient advocates or patient-centered, trying to think of an example, but there's things that it's not necessarily a critique so much of your statistical approach, but it's like, how will you engage patients in the development of your methodology, right? How is there's certain language that people who are experts in patient centered research that they're looking for in those proposals, and they'll ask you questions about that, and it could be a little challenging to to respond to. They're not sort of the typical comments from NIH. I don't know if Kelly or Fawn have had similar any kind of comments on that, if they had any memory of any comments along those lines. But I found that the reviews to be very thorough. I've also gone, after I got in a review and I didn't get it funded, I would go to the project offer and say, hey, what do you think? Is it worth going in again? So they're very responsive in that way. And So I was encouraged. So I kept doing it. And and in fact, my scores were good, pretty good in the first time around. Then they got worse because the review panels change, so it's not easy. At least I found it not easy, but others, that probably says more about me than it says about anything else, but I would encourage persistency.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that fact that review panels changes over time is sort of a common theme across different funders, and it's just a natural process, I would say. But I think that like maybe a slight difference from the PCORI review versus, let's say, NIH would be, they would pick you if you don't spend efforts on stakeholder engagements, and I think those things often come up in the review for my own proposals and others that I was involved in. And sometimes you have to fix it with the help of, discussing PCORI. I think they're very responsive along, like in different stages. I do realize that's the case as well.
Okay, so there's another question about the review process. So question says, do you think scientific merit is the most important criterion? And then yes, let's attack that first.
I don't know. It's hard. Sorry, Kelly or Vaughn. I think it's all important. I think they're looking, I think there's a diverse group of people. I don't think it's like to say, oh, just obviously a scientific merit is important, but it's also important. There are criteria listed in the grant, like they're looking for. And what I do in my proposals, I don't know if other people do this. I literally say this approach, our methodology is addressing this specific criterion, and I bold it. I say so when the reviewers are going through and they say, oh, did this person address criterion 1, they can go check, and they can actually grab text that they can put in their review, right? And so because these reviewers are going through and they're looking, did they meet all these different criteria? So I think it's all important, personally.
Making their life easier as well.
Yeah, make it life easy, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Kelly?
Yeah, I totally agree. I definitely think that that the research strategy, that the methods, that's very important, but as is the engagement, and it's the whole package. And you're gonna be reviewed by this very diverse group of individuals, and so you'll get a lot of comments, and I think ultimately it depends on that full package plus their research portfolio and what they're looking to add.
Okay. And then the second question is sort of asking for the clarification. The PCORI state that the applications are not necessarily required to propose a new method. Do you think a new method development are still preferred over projects that use existing methods? I don't know, because that the one particular funding program we are covering is improving methodology. So I thought each project may have some elements of the proposing new method, but suppose a project proposing that the comparison of the 2 existing method is, I think that's also valid for the improving method part. This program. In that case, do you think the PCORI would prefer that the new method development over the projects like a comparison of the existing method?
My instinct is yes, but I don't want to say that wouldn't be valuable, is comparing existing methods and providing guidance on, propensity score matching versus inverse. I don't know. I'm just making something up, but like, I don't, I would, that's valuable. But my instinct is to say that new methods probably would be more interesting to them. But Kelly and Vaughn, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with Stan. I think the ones that I was involved in are all based on proposing new methods instead of evaluation of existing ones. So I guess my answer would also be that they seem to be more interested in new methods developments versus comparisons of existing ones. Even though
I think they would like to see, like, if you're developing a new method, right?
Of course,
would like to say, like, well, how is it doing better than existing methods? Why is it better? Kind of
right.
thing. So
right, of course.
Yeah, I think we can't really say as contract holders, that's probably something really for the assigned, the program officer, that they could answer that better.
Right.
I see.
But the key point, I think, is that, is this really improving existing methods for conducting patient-centered clinical research?
Mhm. So in my actually experience as a reviewer, I encountered the proposal saying that the knowledge gap exists that there's a several existing methods and then people do not know that what's best, so there was a case like that.
Yeah, so I think
Okay.
there's value in that. I mean, I think there's value in that. And so I don't want to say that they would not be interested in, but certainly definitely talk to the project officer.
Mhm. And what about this question? So how important publishing papers in terms of evaluating the success of the project?
I guess, so I definitely did publish papers for the contracts, and personally, I think that's important to disseminate the work. But I don't know if PCORI is specifically looking for that. I think they're looking for some sort of engagement and dissemination, and whether that's via publications or some other efforts, that's likely okay as well.
Let me just say one thing about, just sorry to interrupt. This is complicated. It's a contract, right? Research is not linear, right? And sometimes you propose something and you learn something along the way, right? And so maybe you get off path, right? And you have to go down a different path, right? And they're very open to that. You just need to talk to them. But it's, when you're putting these milestones, you get like, oh, I'm going to publish this paper in the 3rd quarter of the 2nd year or whatever, or something like that. Sometimes it's hard to predict, 2 or 3 years in advance, where the research is going to go. But it is a contract in that way, and it can be a little bit, I think, stressful as a result of that. But I do find them very accommodating working with you. But it's different than NIH grants in that way, I think.
Okay. And then there's one question we missed early on. So question says that how does PCORI have such a tight timeline between acceptance of LOI and submission of application? I think Kelly must have answered that
I just said, I don't think we
timing.
know. I don't know. You'd have to ask PCORI that. I mean, my guess is that they're just trying to get through these cycles in a relatively efficient manner. But yeah, I'm not sure. Dan or Fan, do you know?
No, I agree. We don't know, but I think there's one occasion where we have to push an application over to another cycle, and once you talk to PCORI, if they approve it, you're okay to wait until the next cycle. That's completely fine. But even if you do so, you have to resubmit the LOI. There's no guarantee that they will approve it because they approved it before. So that's the caveat. But you can always adjust the timeline based on your
I personally don't write an LOI, wait for the response, and then write the grant. I mean, I have an idea, and if it's, if PCORI doesn't want it, I'm hoping that there's another funding agency that I can pitch it to, right? So the work that I do is not lost by kind of, starting to kind of work through the process of fleshing out the grant.
Mhm.
Okay, so I'm going to exercise a little bit of liberty as a moderator. So I found one aspect of the PCORI is very different from the other funding agencies is a patient-centeredness, and then also that the stakeholder engagement. I think Kelly and Ben gave several advice about the stakeholder engagement. But what about the patient-centeredness, especially for the statistical methodology development? How did you handle it, and what works and what didn't work?
Maybe I can go first on this one. Just to elaborate on my presentation, I thought anchoring the methods development in concrete context definitely helps, because otherwise it's very technical, and it's really hard to associate your methods development themselves on their own to patient-centered clinical research. And so it is really the fact that these methods can improve evidence generation from your motivating studies, which actually targets patient-centered outcomes and questions, and your methods can help better answer them. I think that's the connection I find useful. So having good collaborators that could provide those contexts and support those claims, I think would be beneficial.
I can add a little bit about this. So on my second proposal, we have patients on our advisory board, and I have two, there are two clinicians who are actually the head of the advisory board. I'm not the head of the advisory board. And it's actually interesting that the advisory board has gone a completely different direction than I had originally thought for the grant. I thought the advisory board would be kind of looking at my methods, which have to do with like, how do you deal with trials where there's a lot of irregular assessment times about, outcomes. And instead it kind of morphed into talking about what are the reasons, like talking to patients about what are the reasons, why don't you show up on time to for an outcome assessment? Why was it missed? And it really led to this like whole sort of qualitative aspect to the grant that I did, or the contract that I wasn't even expecting, and led to us to writing a letter to the editor, to a journal. And so it took us in a totally different direction, which has been really, really interesting.
Yeah, for me, the patient-centeredness is we were developing designs that were really patient-centered. So one, in rare disease, anything is patient-centered because there's only a few patients. And two, my second one, we were including patient treatment preferences into a clinical trial design. And so that was really patient-centered. And so that's how we addressed the patient-centered aspect. And then also included patient advocates on our advisory board.
Okay. Wonderful. So we are approaching the end of the webinar. So on behalf of all the attendees, let me thank the panelists. Truly that the successful and then acclaimed that the panelists we had, and then shared a lot of the first-hand experience. So thank you so much. And then for those who have still follow questions, please, you can reach out to us individually. And then also this recording will be available on the funded Committee on the Funded Research's website, so you can rewatch it and kind of refresh your memory. All right, thank you so much for coming here, and then watch out for our next seminar series.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Dan, and on behalf of ASA Committee for Funded Research. Thank you all for sharing your wisdom. Really appreciate that. And thank you, Donna, for organizing.
Absolutely. Thank you all. Good night.
Thanks. Bye, talk soon. Take care.